Hello and welcome to today's webinar. I hope you're all doing well, and thank you very much for joining us on this super sunny day in Vancouver. So really appreciate you guys taking time out of your busy day. I'm really excited about this subject on GMAT tips. So I'm assuming all of you guys are sort of mulling or maybe have in the back of your mind pursuing an MBA. So I'm really excited to be able to deliver this topic to you guys, and I've got a fantastic guest speaker, which I'll introduce in a minute. I'm just going to run through a few housekeeping items. I've talked to Alistair, and the presentation is probably going to be about 35 to 40 minutes, which will give us about 20 to 25 minutes of questions at the end. He is going to stop halfway through and just check in with you guys. There is a questions feature on your panel there, so feel free to send through your questions at any time throughout the presentation, and I can read them out to Alistair to answer and make sure that all of your burning questions are answered by the end of the presentation. So as I mentioned, really excited about having this fantastic guest speaker join us today. Alistair Munn has been the graduate test preparation instructor at UBC Continuing Studies for the past 7 years. He has taught the GRE and GMAT course to over 1,000 students and has been involved in new course design. Since attending law school and business school at UBC, he is one of our own, an MBA alumnus from Sauder. He has worked in public policy and business consulting with roles at the Vancouver Board of Trade, the World Bank, and Sierra Systems. And he is currently a manager in Sierra's management consulting practice, focusing on public sector business planning to support large technology investments. So without further ado, I'm going to hand everything over to Alistair to fill you in on what it takes to succeed when writing your GMAT.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Christine, and thanks for organizing this webinar series. I was looking at what you've got upcoming in March, and it looks like some very interesting topics. Welcome everybody. Today I'm going to be wearing my GMAT instructor hat, so that's going to be the focus. I'm excited to get going here. Before I actually dive into the presentation, let me just start off by sharing with you a little bit about my struggle in preparing for this, because as Christine said, I really want to answer your burning questions and give you good, practical, usable advice. But I normally do this in a 30-hour course, not a 1-hour presentation. And based on the experience, I've done that course probably, sadly to say, 40 times now over the last 7 years, over 1,000 students. And I've recognized that everybody, even you guys here today, come with a different amount of understanding about the GMAT. So I find it really hard to guess and to try to cater to everybody. There's also so many resources online. Any of you guys who have done even just a little bit of digging into the GMAT, it's really easy to get overwhelmed by how much stuff there is out there, and there's some really good information, and there's some information that's not so good. So I'm trying to not repeat stuff that I think you could very easily look up. So with that in mind, this afternoon I've prepared, as Christine said, about 35-40 minutes separated into 2 sections. Really it's 8 slides that I want to share with you, and I hope that those slides address most of your questions. That said, I really encourage you to type out your questions at any time as they start coming to you. Christine's going to be gathering them and feeding them to me at the appropriate time. So even starting now, if I give you 10 or 15 seconds, like right off the bat, what are some things that you want to know about the GMAT? What do you want to get out of the next half hour to an hour? So take a few seconds and try to type a few things out. All right, while you guys are doing that, I'm just going to get started. I've really got 2 objectives, as I said, a presentation in 2 parts this afternoon. The first one is to give you some context to level set everybody, just so you guys know really the basics about the GMAT. And the second part then is to get you what I hope to be some really usable advice. So I want to get you some details on the GMAT for the first 15 minutes or so, details about the sections that you're going to come across, the timing, the format of the exam, how it's scored, and some basic facts and figures. And I'll pause for questions after that and then move on to some tips about the less intuitive aspects of test preparation, stuff that really I've seen over time, and I've learned from experience working with the different participants in my course. So it's how to really approach your practice. I mean, everybody here has gone through tons and tons of coursework. You guys know how to study, but studying for the GMAT is quite different than studying for a university final exam. Some words of wisdom to get you through that. And then I do want to leave you with a list of links really to get you started. Some free links, some things that you can even download this afternoon and have a quick read through. So really the two things I want you guys to understand after we're done today is, what am I getting myself into? And then how do I get myself out of it? And I think understanding that right from the start is really going to help build your confidence. Tackling an exam that a lot of people find overwhelming, but a lot of people also find really, really fun. I've done a lot of different standardized tests, from the SAT, the LSAT, the GRE, the GMAT. The GMAT is by far the, I might even hesitate to say it's the only one that is fun to do, but it's by far the most fun out of these standardized tests. So let's get into it. I want to talk a little bit about the structure of the GMAT. It is a 4-section test, and it does take 4 hours, including registration and some of the breaks that you get in between the sections. You're looking at about 4 hours, if not slightly more than that. You get 15 minutes at the start to register, and because it is a very serious test day, some test centers will do fingerprinting, some test centers will take your photo and make that photo available to programs. You're going to be filling in personal information. You can actually, right at the start, select up to 5 schools that you can send your results to. So that's included in the $250 US fee for the GMAT, and you're welcome to send it to even more schools, but you'll have to do that later on, and there's an additional fee for every school that you send it to afterwards. So after you've done the registration and gotten set up, the test will actually begin. The very first section of the test is called the analytical writing assessment. I call it the essay. It's a half-hour exercise, and it's one typed response. Your job in this section is to read a short passage and point out the logical flaws of that passage. It's not to give your opinion on the passage. It's not to discuss other information you might know about the passage. It's really to work within the information given to say, what did the author do well and what did the author not do so well on. So we're expecting about 400 words, about a page and a half or so in a half hour. You then get a 1-minute break, and then the next section starts, and this is all done on the computer, so it's proctored for you. The 1-minute break is there, and it's going to count down. The next section is the newest section of the GMAT. This came in under 2 years ago. It's called the integrated reasoning section, and it replaced actually a second essay on the GMAT. It replaces it with 12 questions, but each question has multiple parts. So I generally like to think of this as there's 30 tasks in this half-hour exercise, and you're answering short questions from drop-downs or answering yes or no questions or true or false questions based on a large set of information that comes from all different sources. It could be visual graphics. You might have some math in there. There might be data tables, like a small Excel spreadsheet, different emails or memos or journal articles, and they want you to pull all of that together to make sense of information from a whole bunch of different sources, and that's why they call it integrated reasoning. They put this in because they think that it more closely reflects the type of thinking required in an MBA program. So they say it does assess higher level reasoning skills. This, I would say, is probably the least important section for now of the GMAT, just because it's new. Programs are still evaluating how they're going to use the data in their admissions process. The most important section of the GMAT there's 2 of them, and they come at the end of the test. So you're now an hour into the exam. There's a short break after the integrated reasoning section, and we get into the multiple choice portions of the GMAT. The first section that you're going to see in multiple choice is a 75-minute math section called quantitative reasoning. There's 37 questions to do in that 75 minutes, so if you're already giving yourself a math test, you'll note that it's about 2 minutes a question that you've got. And there's two types of questions they'll ask you. Problem-solving questions. This is very similar to what you would get in a high school math test. Solve for X, or here's a word problem, and sort through that information. There's also a second type called data sufficiency, and data sufficiency problems are very unique to the GMAT. As the title says, data sufficiency is asking you whether or not you have enough information, sufficient data, to actually solve a problem. They're not asking you to come up with the answer. They're asking you to tell them whether or not you're able to come up with the answer. So do I have enough information, or do I not have enough information? So that's slightly different. It's a different way of looking at problem solving. No matter which type of problem you're working on, the math that they're testing is all the same. It gets up to about halfway through grade 10 math if you guys did math in BC. I'm not sure about other provinces or other countries, but you're looking at intermediate arithmetic. You're getting into powers and roots at most, some intermediate algebra. So you will have to solve for X and Y in a systems of equation. There will be a few quadratic equations here and there. You're not doing things like calculus. You're not doing trigonometry in your geometry. You're not doing difficult proofs or anything like that that you'd find later on in your math career. So it is grade 10 math. A lot of the questions, people are surprised to find that the math required in the question is really like grade 5 math or grade 6 math. So if you're struggling on some of this stuff, very often it's not the math, it's the type of thinking required to support the math. And I'll get into that in a little bit. So you've got 75 minutes to do this. You get another 8-minute break after you're done this section, and that leads us to the final section on the GMAT. It's the verbal reasoning section. Also a 75-minute multiple choice section. You've got 41 questions this time, so you get just a little bit less time to do every question. It's about 1 minute and 45 seconds on average, and there's 3 types of questions that they ask in this section. They'll ask reading comprehension questions where you read a passage and tell them about the main idea or tell them about a certain detail in the passage. You get critical reasoning questions where you read a couple sentences and you say, what extra information might make this a better argument? What extra information might make this a worse argument? And there's a few different things they can ask you to do in critical reasoning. And you also get sentence correction questions which focus on grammar. It's really basic English grammar, basic business writing. You have to identify whether or not a sentence is constructed correctly, and if not, where the error is and how to better phrase it. So that's the GMAT in really at a glance. That's the 4 hours that you're going to be spending. These are the different sections that you're going to come across on test day. So you can see it is very much a marathon. It's something that you have to work your way up to, but it's something that is absolutely doable, and especially for you guys who've gone through Sauder's program at UBC, you guys are very used to switching channels and working on a whole bunch of different information in quick succession. So you guys are very well positioned to do well on the GMAT. I wanted to then address the scoring on the GMAT, and generally when people ask about scoring on the GMAT and they say, well, what's your GMAT score? People are really looking at that total score right here from 200 to 800. So that's generally what you see reported, but on test day and in your official score report, you're actually going to get 10 different numbers on your GMAT score. So you get separate scores for your essay and for the integrated reasoning section. Those always stay separate. And then you get separate scores for the math and the verbal portions from 0 to 60. And they combine those. Somehow they turn 60 and 60 into a score out of 800 to get you your total score. And for each one of those 5 numbers, you get a corresponding percentile, because the numbers, if I told you you had a 45 in math or a 51 in English, that wouldn't really tell you very much. The percentile allows you to compare yourself to the test takers over the past 3 years and where you stand with that. So if you are in the 80th percentile For integrated reasoning, it means you've done better than 80% of the people who have taken the test over the past 3 years, which is about 750,000 people that they're using in that pool. So just as another sample here, here's a quick screen cap from a sample score report. This is what you're going to see as your official score report. It'll tell you the day you wrote the test, and you can see that you get separate scores for verbal and math, as well as the percentile, and then you get your total score. And the analytical writing and integrated reasoning scores always stay separate from that total score. So that's how the GMAT is scored. I'll give you a little bit of, I guess, some of the facts and figures in just a second, but before we get into that, I wanted to emphasize the fact that the GMAT is written on the computer. So that makes it quite different from the SAT or the LSAT. The GRE exam is also written on the computer, so there are some similarities, but it's something that we generally aren't exposed to. Certainly, if you've been out of school for a while, I hadn't written any university exams on a computer. So it may be a little bit foreign, but there are some real advantages to writing on the computer. You don't have to worry about your handwriting and the legibility of your handwriting. If you need to move things around in your essay, you can certainly copy and paste rather than to have to draw arrows and confuse the reader. For the multiple choice sections, the GMAT is actually computer adaptive. And what that means is not only are you answering questions on the computer, but the software, as you answer your questions, it's actually assessing your answers the second that you answer the question, and it determines what question to feed you next based on your answer to a previous question. So the test is always adapting to your performance, and a test that I get would look very different from a test that any one of you would get, just because it's really trying to personalize to best assess your abilities. So it's not there trying to trick you. It's not there trying to give you stuff that you can't handle. It's really trying to give you questions that the computer program needs in order to assess how well you're doing. So what a computer adaptive test means, number one, you can actually sign up to write it whenever you're ready to, because it's written in a computer lab. You actually schedule an appointment any day of the week at multiple times during the day. The schedule is actually all online on the MBA.com website. So you don't have to worry about, oh, I've got 6 months to get ready and there's only 2 opportunities this year to write the test. The downside, though, is, of course, you can't underline or circle keywords in passages. If you're working on a geometry diagram, you're going to have to get used to looking at the screen rather than being able to mark up the diagram. You are given scrap paper, so you can redraw things. You can take notes if required, but it's a bit different than being able to mark up your exam paper. The other thing that's a bit foreign to people is because the exam is assessing your performance in real time, you can't skip questions and you can't come back to previous questions. You have to answer the question in front of you before you're allowed to move on, and you're never going to see that question again. So if you get the right answer to a question, the test actually gets harder and harder and harder because it's trying to assess, well, what level question is actually going to trip this person up a little bit. And your score, though, depends not on how many questions you get right or wrong, but on the difficulty level of the questions that you're working on. So the scoring is a little bit more foreign than you'd be used to in a university exam. And that makes it tricky in practice to assess exactly how well you're doing, because if you're just working on a set of 10 questions in practice, it's not adapting to you. And you can't really say whether you're going to be at 200 or at an 800. So just a little note here at the end that the analytical writing and the integrated reasoning sections, those first 2 half-hour sections, are not computer adaptive. So I do really encourage you to visualize how that's going to feel, not only when you're doing your practice problems and getting started, but at different points throughout your preparation time. You really want to build your confidence by understanding how is this all going to look and feel on test day, and it's really worthwhile doing that. I just wanted to end this first half of the talk with some facts and figures. Each year 250,000 people take the test from all over the world, so they do put a lot of effort into making this test as culturally neutral as possible. Some numbers about averages. The average score globally is a 4 or 4.5 in the essay, a 4 to 5 in the integrated reasoning, and a total score of just under 550 for the 2 multiple choice sections, the math and the verbal. It's about evenly split, and there's almost as many women who take this test as men. The average age is 26. In Canada, it's a little bit higher. We're closer to 28, and our average scores are a little bit higher too. Your scores are good for 5 years from the date you take the exam, so programs will accept scores as valid for up to 5 years. And I just pulled a few graphics from the GMAT website to show you how much time on average people spend preparing. Now this is, I wasn't sure whether I wanted to include this because it is very personal. You have to understand where you're coming from. If you generally did well in all sorts of courses at Sauder, from HR courses to logistics to finance, then you may be able to more quickly absorb the information, the broad set of information on the GMAT. If you did well on your courses but you only concentrated on finance, you may need to question whether you're comfortable with some of the other areas. Not that we're testing you on business stuff, but it's really the foundational skills behind the business topics. So you might have to adjust your studying time depending on your personal situation and how well you need to do, what kind of score you're targeting. So you can see that the average is about 50 to 100 hours spent preparing. If you do take a course to prepare, I think that a course actually, it does 2 things. It presents you with new ways of looking at topics, and in that way it can really help you do better. But because it presents you with new ways of looking at things, often you have to spend even more time because you're approaching questions in a very different way than you naturally would. So I generally tell people that this studying for the GMAT, treat it like it was a 3-credit university course. So you're spending 50 to 100, 150 hours. That's kind of the expected amount of time. So that flyby should give you just some context so that we've all got the same baseline here as we move into the second part of the presentation. And I want to pause here to really take any questions of clarification, other things that I might not have addressed in this first part. So I'll ask Christine, is there anything that's coming through?
Yes, we do have some questions here. Okay, so we've got, I have a full-time job, 11 hours a day, Monday to Friday, and I need to study as efficiently as possible. Any techniques? Should I go straight to questions and study the ones I get wrong for example?
Okay, I'm going to hold off on that until part 2. So Christine, if you can ask that again if I haven't sufficiently addressed that in part 2, because I'm going to talk about how we should approach studying.
Okay, perfect. Let me see here. I've got, if my goal is to score over 700, will studying through an online course be sufficient?
Okay, so same thing. I'm going to talk about that in part 2.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask you guys to listen intently for part 2.
I'm thinking that these are probably all part 2.
Okay, so people are really, so why don't I just dive in there, and certainly if anything comes up around the structure, the sections, the format that you want to know, I'm happy to address that afterwards. I just wanted to pause here to make sure we were all clear on that part.
Yeah, I would say that these are probably best left till the end.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay.
Well, why don't we keep going here? So part 2 was really the how to approach your practice and some of the, I think, less intuitive things that I've come across over the years. So now that you understand what you're getting yourself into, this is really how I see an average test taker, and I think I'm being very generous with this 10-week timeline for an average test taker. Usually somebody will say, well, I want to do an MBA, what do I need? Well, I need the GMAT because I've done everything else, or I'm working on my work experience. And they'll go online and read a little bit about the GMAT. They might go to Chapters and buy a book. Could be a Kaplan book or a Princeton Review book, or maybe the official guide, and do a whole bunch of practice questions, in, a few hundred practice questions. Usually that's done very quickly. So either they'll do it right up front, or they'll do a few and realize, oh, I don't have the time for this, set it aside for a while and pick it up kind of as time permits. And I have to admit, I was one of these people when I first started. I was finishing law school and I was writing the GMAT, and it was over Christmas break in my last term that I was like, well, what else am I going to do after law school? And I was looking into MBA programs, and I bought the book over Christmas break and got started studying for a couple weeks in January, and then life took over. And that's kind of, I guess, the question that was posed. You know, you're working 11-hour days. Well, how do you fit GMAT in there? And I'll get into that a bit. But that's kind of the average test taker. And when I talk to people generally, that's kind of what they do, is just a bunch of practice questions. They might try a practice exam, and I would say it's 50-50. Some people don't get to a practice exam because it's really hard to carve out the brain space for a 4-hour sit-down before test day. So this approach to me is like almost like winging it. And because the GMAT in some respects is an aptitude test, some people are just naturally comfortable with this. They might be really strong at math, have pretty good grammar, and just not a nervous test taker. They'll probably do okay doing that. But to me, it is a high-risk way of approaching the GMAT. So what I'd like to suggest here is that you become a lot more consistent over my suggested 10 weeks. And you can play with this timeline to stretch it or to compress it to whatever works for you. But keep in mind that kind of 100 hours, right? So if we're doing that in 10 weeks, it still is 10 hours a week. It's an hour or two most days that you're spending studying for the GMAT. And you will really want to start off by dusting off the cobwebs, learning the content in bite-sized chunks. You absolutely want to do practice questions. There's no problem with that. But you don't want to just cover all of the GMAT topics all at once. You really want to understand how the topics are organized. So you might focus a day actions, a day on it's about doing practice questions, but it's about seeing, well, what works? What topics am I naturally comfortable with? Maybe I just never get a fractions question wrong, so I'm good with fractions. But also seeing where you can learn new tools for the other questions. And preparing for the GMAT is not about memorizing dozens of strategies or hundreds of different approaches depending on the type of question and the wording in the question. I'm really against that. It's about understanding what are the highest level tools that I can use for almost all of the questions that I work on. So things like recognizing when you can very comfortably estimate to a question, when you can actually plug in answer choices to assess a question. And one of the things I mentioned in my course is 8 out of 10 algebra problems can be done without actual algebra. I don't create an equation. I don't actually solve for x and y the traditional way. It's really about understanding and organizing the information in a question. So approaching math that way is very foreign to a lot of people, which is very new, which means you really have to start fresh, and you have to spend the time building that up, and you can't rush to combine different topics. Otherwise, you'll end up confusing yourself, and you'll do more harm than you do good. So practice questions are absolutely good. I generally say it looks like a big number, 800 practice questions, but they go by fairly quickly. I mean, you're spending 2 to 5 minutes on a practice question, including looking through the solution and doing a bit of review. So 800 practice questions can really just be a few weeks of consistent practice. But you'll recognize on this slide that this is really just one work stream in your preparation. It's an important one. I've put it in the middle, but there's stuff that has to surround that I think is just as important as actually doing the practice questions and doing the review. One of the things that I think is really important is exactly what we just spent the last 20 minutes talking about. It's the context. Like, when might I see this practice or this type of a question? So if you're working on a sentence correction question, well, it's one thing to do a set of 10 when you're fresh and you're awake and you're energetic on a Saturday morning. It's another thing to see a sentence correction question 3.5 hours into an exam. Right? The way you're going to be thinking about it is different. Your mind is going to be a little bit more tired, and you have to really understand that you have to cope with that situation. So learning about the context, learning about the structure, reviewing and visualizing how it's going to be, I'm not saying spend hours on it, but really come back to this every few weeks throughout your practice. To the person that was asking about the most efficient way to study, the fact of the matter is that the GMAT is going to take time, right? There's no magic wand that's going to allow you to do exceptionally well in 5 or 10 hours of studying if you weren't already there, and maybe you are already there. But you do need to evaluate your time commitment and be realistic and plan out, you know, have a high-level plan 10 weeks out, but have a very detailed plan. How am I going to spend my week? I'm going to spend 2 hours here, an hour here, 3 hours on a Saturday morning, and what am I going to accomplish? So really have that study plan to guide your progress, and that plan shouldn't just be done right at the beginning. I really tell people in my class to go back to that plan, and if they're spending even 15 minutes a day reviewing that plan, adjusting, saying, oh, well, I spent an hour on this topic, but I'm still not comfortable with it. Should I be adding more time to this? If I add more time, well, where's that going to come from? Is it going to push out my test date? Or is it, am I just going to cut out something else and prioritize the GMAT for that? So really staying organized, not just working on practice question after practice question after practice question, but seeing the light at the end of the tunnel and organizing your path towards that, tracking and analyzing your progress as you move towards the light at the end of the tunnel. That is extremely important. So that, to me, if you're spending 10 to 20% of your time on, it's really project management, right? And you treat this as a project, and it's very worthwhile to do. Alongside all of that, take a look at the different programs that are out there. Whoever said that they're aiming for 700, to me that's a really good number to aim for, because it's a very safe number, certainly for any Canadian program and for most programs in the States. If you have very good work experience and pretty good grades, a 700 will give you a very good chance at even the top programs in the States. So it's a good number, but ask yourself whether you need that. Right? If you're looking at an executive MBA and you've got 10 or 15 years of work experience, well, maybe a 570 might be good enough, and you don't need to spend the 150 or 200 hours to get you to the 700. So really understand the different programs that are going to work for you, and learn about their detailed GMAT score requirements. So that number 700 is only one part of your score. Do they look at the essay? Do they look at the integrated reasoning section? What is their expectation there? Do they weigh the math part heavier or lighter than the verbal portion? If you're applying to a very math-heavy program, you know, MIT, Sloan School of Business, or University of Chicago that has heavy emphasis on finance and economics, you pretty much have to nail the math part of the GMAT. If you're applying to a more general management program, they're probably looking much more for a balance, that you're comfortable with both the math and the verbal part. And really, after having taken a few weeks to absorb this, to digest it, to think about it, you should be setting a target score about halfway through your practice, so that you have a target in mind. And the last bit here is, as you're doing practice questions, as I said, don't just do practice questions one after the other. Start putting together topics. Start preparing a very pointed set of practice questions to work on, to see whether you're comfortable with a topic, and then build up from that. Put a few topics together. So work on some arithmetic and some algebra. Work on sentence correction and critical reasoning. Do sets of 10, and then do sets of 15, and then do sets of 20. You're going to be trying to build up to 78 math and verbal questions on test day. So it is a 4-hour marathon. And once you're close to there, get going on practice exams. So don't wait until the week of the test, and certainly like a lot of people I talk to who haven't even done practice exams before they've tried the test, don't do that, because you really want to give yourself that feedback in these 3 sections here. As you do practice exams, you should be spot checking with more practice questions on your areas that you want to improve on, and you should be comparing that against your target score and to see whether you're making progress against that, to see how far off your target score you are there. So there really is that feedback loop that you should be working on for 3 or 4 weeks before test day, so that when you walk into the test on test day, you've got 4, 5, 6 practice exams under your belt. The last few should be pretty consistent, and that's the score that you should be expecting on test day. It shouldn't be a surprise to you what you're expecting to get on test day. So that's really the preparation life cycle. You can see in green the practice questions is one thing, but I do want to emphasize that there's so much more around it that you can spend your time on. And I think that's a great thing, because doing practice questions can get a bit tiring. So being able to spend your time on other parts that are very worthwhile and that are going to move you towards your target score and towards your goal is a very good thing. So I've got a whole bunch of words of wisdom that I've collected. Again, I'm trying to distill my 30 or 40 hours of what I tell people in my class into some key points here. So I hope that I've emphasized enough. Don't only do practice questions. A lot of people say, well, I want a score of 700 or 750, so what are the hardest questions? Where do I find a source for just hard questions? I'm going to hope to convince you that that's not the way to approach your studying, even if you want a score of 700 or 750. So don't only do hard questions. Don't see every single question as different or unique. Right? I said on test day, you have to give your all for every single question, because you're not going to be able to skip questions or go back. But in practice, you really want to start seeing these similarities. Don't worry about timing or scoring too early. I often get people in the first week say, well, this is taking me forever, or, you know, I only got 5 out of 10 on this part. Well, in week 1, I'm not too worried about that. But of course, don't forget about timing and scoring at some point through your studying. So if you go to exam day and you haven't thought about how you're going to spend your 75 minutes or what your target score should be based on your practicing and what the programs you're interested in require from you, you haven't done yourself justice. So you have to consider that at some point, but not too early. Don't get caught up in the psychology of constantly guessing, well, how hard was this question, both in practice and on test day? Because it doesn't matter how hard it is, it's how well can you get through the question. If it's an easy question, well, that's great, get through it. If it's a really hard question, you're still going to be giving it your best try here. And don't aim for 800. This is something I really have to tell people in the GMAT course, because a lot of people, you guys have all gone through your undergrads. A lot of you have done very well on your undergrads, where in any course you're aiming to get 100. That's your goal generally, is how can I get perfect on this test? And I'll tell you that of the 250,000 test takers, usually under 30 people will actually score an 800. So it's a very, very, very small slice of the population. And you don't need an 800. An 800 doesn't mean they got every single answer correct either. So I think there's a lot of unknowns there, and 800 certainly doesn't need to be your target. So you might need to shift your mindset a little bit here. So I just wanted to go through each one of these in just a little bit more detail over the next few minutes. As I said, don't only do practice questions, but really consider that last slide that I talked about. What else do I need to consider? The context, the planning, my life commitments, my target score, the programs I'm interested in, and how that's all going to fit together. And adjust that weekly, adjust that a few times a week along the way, so that your study plan at the end will have looked a lot different than the one that you started with. For those of you that are interested in finding hard questions, I get this question all the time. There are not very many sources of hard GMAT questions, what I call 700 level or above GMAT questions. There's one book from Kaplan, and I've got a link to that at the end of this presentation, that they call Kaplan 800, and it's got some hard questions. But the reason there isn't a whole bunch of materials on just hard questions, even though everybody wants to do really well on the GMAT, is because it's not required. And you can take this from me, somebody who can score well above 700 over and over on the GMAT. If you are comfortable with the mid-level and the slightly more challenging questions, you're going to be well positioned to work on the hard questions. Even people who are scoring at the 700 level in the 90th or above the 90th percentile, you're only going to see a handful of hard questions. The bulk of the exam is going to be at the mid to slightly above average question level. So keep that in mind. And more importantly, if you're not at the 700 level, well, you're never going to see those questions. So if you're working at the 600 level, that's the type of question that you should really be focused on, because you're not even going to get to a 700 level question. It doesn't matter if you can answer all the 700 level questions that take a very different skill set. If you can't do the 500 level or the 600 level questions, you're never going to see those. So really you have to progress along the way, get comfortable at each step along the way. Don't just dive in to the hard questions. The people who do the best on the GMAT are the ones who don't see every single question as different. They understand that the GMAT at its core is not a math test. It uses some math skills. It's not a grammar test. It uses a certain understanding of English grammar, but it uses those things in order to bring in logic. So the more you can spot patterns, the more you can make connections between things, the more you can organize information to understand, oh, this is how these pieces of information are related together, the more you're going to see success on the GMAT. And that's, to me, the hardest thing to get to. It does take a lot of, and it's not just more practice questions again. It takes a lot of thinking through the questions. It takes a lot of exploring the questions. And one of the things that I recommend to people is to actually take a practice question after you've done it and try to think of different answer choices. How would it have changed my approach had the answer choices been grouped a lot closer together or farther apart? Or what if they gave me a negative number instead of a positive? Or what if they changed this word in the reading comprehension passage? If you can think more like the test maker than the test taker, you're going to actually start seeing that not every single question is different. And so if there's one thing that I do want to emphasize, it would be that piece right there in your approach. Don't just do practice questions, explore the practice questions. Worrying about timing and scoring, again, don't worry about it right now. Just learn the stuff, learn the content, and learn it well. All right, focus on the basics first, including if you need to bring in a new approach to a certain topic. If your natural way of doing it isn't giving you success or it's taking you too long, worry about that. All right, but of course, at some point, as we said, start thinking about it. About halfway through your preparation, you have to understand what's going to work and what isn't, and is it all going to fit together? So if all my questions take me 3 minutes to answer, well, I'm not going to get that section complete in 75 minutes. So what do I have to do? Should I be doing more practice to become faster at things? Was it just 1 or 2 questions that took me 6 or 7 minutes to get through? And therefore, maybe I just have to skip those types of topics when I see them on test day. Maybe that's my best approach. I just wanted to flip to, here's a quick sample. And I evaluate a lot of different software and a lot of different books out there. And here's just, I just did a quick set a while back. And I just wanted to highlight, even for myself, there's some questions that, and here's my pace right here, some questions that do take me quite a while, 5.5 minutes to do a question. And I'm okay with that because I know that I can afford that time. I've got other questions that take me 30 seconds or 20 seconds to do. So I know that even though there's 1 minute and 45 seconds to do a verbal question or 2 minutes to do a math question, not every single question is going to have that time limit for me. So it's really from your experience, from your practice, that you're going to get to that point, and you have to develop your own rhythm as to what's going to work for you on test day. So it really should be a natural rhythm. You shouldn't have to spend a ton of time on the first few questions just to make sure that you're off on the right foot. With the amount of practice and the amount of knowledge that you've got going into test day, it should happen naturally. The last couple things I wanted to say was really about the difficulty level of questions. People in class often ask me after we do a sample question, well, how hard was that one? Was that considered easy or considered hard? Again, it's giving your best effort to a question, whether it's easy or hard, because on test day, you're actually never going to know. Was it an easy question? Was it a hard question? Some people think of a question as easy, but it just happens to be that they're really good at that topic. Like the logic just comes through for them. And that question could be a 700 level question, and you might be asking yourself, why? But it's because everybody else finds it hard. You just happen to be good at that one topic. And there might be a question that's ranked at the 500 level, a very mid-level question, and it might take you 5 minutes to get through. So it's a really personal thing, and it shouldn't matter. You're giving your best, and you're developing your rhythm throughout these 78 multiple choice questions. And of course, as I said, you shouldn't need to aim for that 800 on test day. You should know what you deserve and what you expect and what you need to get. And for nobody is that an 800. So based on your practice, based on your target score, based on the programs that you're interested in, you should have a number in mind, and you're aiming to replicate that. You're not aiming to hit a home run on test day. You're aiming just to repeat exactly what worked in your practice exams leading up to test day. And if you get that score, you're happy. If you happen to do better than that, well, even better. So keep that in mind as you're approaching test day. I just wanted to end off with the different preparation options here, and I know I'm a little bit over the time that I wanted to spend, and I do want to address your questions, but I'm hoping that this addresses some of your questions on, well, how do I get going studying? Really, I see 4 different options. There's either self-studying, there's an online course, there's an in-person course that you can take, or there's actually private tutoring that some places or some people will offer. So putting that all together, the self-studying is obviously the most cost-efficient approach. There's a lot of resources available online. A lot of them are free. They're not always of the highest quality, but they're what I call good enough, that if you knew what you were looking for, you could do very well self-studying. It allows you to get going right away. You don't have to wait for a course to start or anything. You can get going this afternoon if you need to. And this is actually where I ask people to start, whether or not they end up taking a course online or in person or asking for private tutoring. Self-studying builds your confidence, and that's so important because for a lot of people, getting into an MBA program is going to be a very different experience, and going into it saying, you know, I did this on my own and it wasn't that hard, because it's a test that brings in skills that you already have, and certainly having a BCom gives you a lot of those skills. You're going to be walking into the MBA program with a lot more confidence, and it's certainly very doable. So I do tell people, you know, if they're asking about courses, I say, well, just buy a book and get started. All right, go onto the website, read a few things, buy a book, and get started. And if after a couple weeks you find you're not where you want to be, then start considering other options. There are a ton of online courses, and there are some that are quite different. Some of them actually deliver lectures. Some of them have videos. Some of them are based on practice questions with kind of PowerPoint-style guidance there. The benefit is that, of course, they've sifted through the resources online, and they've pulled together, or very often created, something that's been researched and that they think will work for test takers. An online course often gives you a study plan. They'll tell you this is generally what we expect from you, but it's flexible. You take it on your own time, whether that's in the morning, whether it's once a week, whether it's once a month. It's on your own time. So for some people that's really good. For some people that can be kind of dangerous, right, because you really have to stay on top of it. And because it's not generally delivered by a person, you may have contact to an instructor, but you can't ask your questions right away like you would be able to do in private tutoring or with an in-person course. So an in-person course gives you very much the same thing as an online course, except there's more structure, and that's what I get a lot of good feedback about, is that, you know, I'm glad that you forced me to come here twice a week for 3 hours, because otherwise I wouldn't have spent that time on the GMAT, and at least something is better than nothing. So that's actually, you know, a part of the in-person course that's not hard. It's not hard to design, and it doesn't take a lot of experience and skill as a teacher to do that, but I just force people to sit there for 3 hours twice a week. And of course, during that time, as we go through the material, before class, after class, I can give people direct feedback. They can ask questions and get answers right away, as well as through email during the week. And then the final option with private tutoring, very often a private tutor will actually customize materials for you based on your strengths and weaknesses, depending on how strict the tutor is and your scheduling. The study plan may be flexible, or it might be quite rigid if that's what you need. And of course, with a private tutor, it's completely personal feedback. You get to ask any question you want and get that feedback. So those are the options that are out there. I do recommend that you get started with self-studying, at least for a weekend, if not more than that. You know yourself best, and you can then decide what's going to work for you. So I just wanted to end off with this. I've talked to Christine, and she's actually going to try emailing this out in some shape or form so that you don't have to retype all these links. I'm considering this set of materials the must-have. So those of you who want to get started on your own, this is really the basic stuff and the good stuff that you need. So there's the official guide, which is like a $40 or $50 guide from the official test maker that has past test questions, 800 questions, absolutely necessary to have. A lot of courses will actually offer that as part of the course. That's in our course, that's the guide that we assign questions from during the week. You should have an error sheet or a tracking sheet that goes along with that guide. It's an Excel spreadsheet that's just going to track your progress, how much you've done, how many questions a day, whether you're getting them right or wrong, which topics you're strong in or weak in. There's a few of them online that I have to say actually when I started teaching 7 years ago, I didn't see any, and so I created one, and I've seen versions of mine appear with different people's names on them over the years, and they've been downloaded close to 100,000 times now. So people are seeing value for this, but they're out there, and you should absolutely download one of those. Download the official test practice test software. It's free. It's got 2 practice exams that are worth their weight in gold, so keep those for when you're ready. And then there's a quick document that tells you about what the test center rules are, what their rules are in terms of what they have to offer you and what you have to abide by to test it for test day. So I think those are the basics, and that's a quick way to group a bunch of materials and get started. And then there's a bunch of other stuff that I think if you want some specific topic guides, the good ones are the Manhattan GMAT topic guides. The official guide that I recommended in the must-haves doesn't give you any strategy. It just gives you practice questions and solutions, which are very useful, but I think slightly incomplete. So the Manhattan guides talk a little bit more about strategy. If you find 800 questions from the official guides aren't enough, there's supplemental guides for math and for verbal, another 600 questions between the 2 of them. If you're struggling with grammar and sentence correction, there's a free about 300-page handbook that you can use kind of to reference different areas of grammar if you're studying that part. There's a whole bunch of phone apps that are free, and those of you who really absolutely need to have those really hard questions to do, it's the Kaplan 800 guide. So I'll work with Christine to make sure that you guys get your hands on this stuff, on the links to these materials. So that really was it for me. I've gone on a little bit longer than I hoped to, but there's 5 or 10 minutes left for questions. So why don't we open it up?
Great. Thank you, Alistair. What a fantastic presentation. So in-depth and such great, just a real good overview of everything. So that was fantastic. Thank you so much. I did, as we were going through part 2, I did sort of go back to the questions box that I have here, and there was a number of things that were, a number of questions that were submitted but definitely covered. So if there's anybody that didn't feel that their question that they had originally submitted wasn't thoroughly answered, please feel free to resubmit it. But I think we've pretty much hit on all the points. There's a couple here. Okay, let me just back up. So just going back to prep courses, I know you did give us lots of in-depth information. When you're choosing a prep course, should you take into consideration what your weaknesses are?
I would say from what I understand, there's most prep courses cover end-to-end what you need for the GMAT, and they emphasize things fairly similarly. The UBC course, we emphasize math a little bit more. I would say 60 to 65% of the time is spent on math, and 35 to 40% of the time is spent on verbal. And from what I've seen in the other offerings, that's fairly similar across the board when you're taking the complete GMAT course. And the reason for that is that math, there's just more strategies we can bring in. Even if you're an engineer, even if you've got a strong math background, there are more strategies that we can get you to working faster through questions rather than doing it the traditional way. That gives you more time to work on the questions that will challenge you. There's a little bit less that we can do in the verbal section, and again, that's from what I've seen in other courses, that's fairly similar. There are other offerings that are what I'll call a la carte, where you can just choose, oh, I just want to buy the reading comprehension bit, and you get like 10 videos for reading comprehension and so on. So that's an option too. But again, it depends where you're at, and I'm going to go back to give yourself a week or 2 weeks to try self-studying, even try a practice exam. And I'm suggesting a couple sources for practice exams in that resources list. Just try one out, and you'll start, as you analyze your score, you'll see, am I better at math or verbal? Within verbal, was I strong in reading comprehension and weak in critical reasoning, or was it pretty flat across the board, in which case I might want to improve with a more general course? So you kind of need to diagnose on your own, and there are resources for you to do that.
Great, thank you. Is there a negative impact on how many times you take the test?
Good question. So that's one of many things that I wasn't able to get into in detail. The short answer is no. For almost every program that I've looked into, including the top U.S. programs, the most well-known Canadian programs, like the 10 that are well-known in Canada, they'll take your highest GMAT score from the past 5 years. So they get to see all of them, but they'll take your highest score. So that's the party line that they offer. I cannot think of a program that still averages your score, which was what was done about 10 or 15 years ago.
Okay, great. Could you give us a quick overview on the differences between the Manhattan and the Kaplan online courses?
Unfortunately, I can't. I haven't. I've looked at them, and what I would be able to give you is what I could read from the websites. I'm familiar with them, but I haven't taken those courses. Is there one that you would recommend over the other? I think they're both probably, again, the short answer is no. I personally would do Manhattan. I like Manhattan because they offer a lot of strategies. I don't like them because they sometimes offer too much. They've got just a lot of material. But both Kaplan and Manhattan are very well-researched courses, very intuitive online interfaces from what I've seen, and are both good courses.
Great. Do you have any tips on how to practice the writing essay portion?
The writing portion, let's see. I think it's an area that shouldn't be emphasized too much. In order to practice it, for the half hour, when I teach the course, I divide the writing portion into 3. And the first section is the brainstorming and the organizing of information, which I suggest spending 5 or 7 minutes on out of that half hour. And for most people, if they can't nail that part, the writing doesn't come through. Even if you're a good writer, it's going to be confusing. It's not going to be clear what you've written and what your point really is. So for most people, I say spend 80% of your time just looking at a sample passage and just trying to brainstorm. Take a piece of scrap paper and put down your bullet points and then try to organize them and leave it at that. You can also just copy and paste the first sentence of any writing passage into Google, and you'll come across a whole bunch of different sample answers that people have written. Some of them bad, some of them good. So that's the danger of the self-study part, but it's out there. There are different responses that you can compare yourself to as you're doing that. But I definitely say spend a lot of your time on that first 5 to 7 minutes.
Great, thank you. And there's one more question, and I could actually answer this. Actually, we have 2 more. Oh, one that I can answer and one that you can answer. With respect to this presentation that Alistair's done for us today, I have recorded it, and it will be actually loaded onto our YouTube channel, so you will be able to access the presentation as many times as you'd like to make sure that you've gotten all your questions answered and all the information that you need. Their last question, could you clarify whether or not the essay and integrated reasoning is used to calculate the score out of 800?
It's not. Those two are completely separate scores to the 800.
Great. Thank you. Well, we have arrived at our 1 o'clock stopping time here. And Alistair, thank you again. This was fantastic, and I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule and day to present this information to the alum. It was extremely valuable. So thank you.
It's been fun. I appreciate the opportunity.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And there's a ton of thank yous that are coming in for you here.
I appreciate that. Thanks.
Yes, lots. Yes, very, very much appreciating your time as well. So, and a big thank you to you guys for joining us today. Oh, we have someone joining us from Paris. There we go. So we've got international audience today. Fantastic. Anyway, so thank you to all of you for taking time out of your day again and joining us today. And I hope that you guys can join us next weekend when we talk about tools to thrive at work. So I'm Christine Thody. I'm the Manager of Alumni Careers here at the Sauder School of Business. And, of course, my guest speaker, Alistair Mon. Thank you very much, and I hope all of you have a great day.
Thank you, guys.